talking about corporate digital responsibility to you all today, which, although we're at the Apidays conference, this will apply not only to any technology that anybody's developing, but to thinking about the impact of the technology on people and planet. So just by way of introduction to myself, although I'm here as corporate digital responsibility and specifically digital responsibility, which is my podcast that connects the dots on the world's movement around CDR, which I'll introduce shortly. I'm also here as the founder or co-founder of two born in the AI businesses, one around recruitment and one around tech consultancy. My background is 30 years as a technologist. I've worked in large global organizations. I started off as a software developer, so I've understood the full kind of range of roles through coding and testing, through architecture and delivery, and through senior exec roles, both as chief operating officer, chief digital officer, and a consulting partner. But today I'm talking about digital responsibility. The global corporate digital responsibility movement we defined as a set of practices and behaviours that help an organisation use data and digital technologies in ways that are perceived as socially, economically and environmentally responsible. And that came out of a range of different work that has been done over the past 6-7 years now, different research in different countries by different groups of people. Personally, I was involved from 2016 working for a guy called Thierry Breton. Thierry was then chief exec of Atos. He's now EU commissioner, introducing things like the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act. And we had a premise that said the digital divide is growing, the rate of change of technology is too great, people can't keep up, businesses can't keep up, and so what do we do about that? And out of that research, we defined corporate digital responsibility, as did a number of other people around the world. In 2020, we brought them all together. So academics, business experts, sustainability experts, and more aggregated that research and that thinking to bring together both what was in Germany and Switzerland and the US and the UK and other countries into a cohesive holistic framework, if you like, and that's what we defined as the International CDR Manifesto, a framework to help people think about the impact of the decisions that they make, irrespective of whether it's a broad technology strategy or indeed a single API. And what I'm going to do today is to introduce you to that manifesto and then to help think about how that can be used within businesses to think about the work that you're doing and the impact it can have on people and planet. So I've done many presentations on CDR, and some last 4 hours and some last, well, this one needs to last about 4 minutes. So it's very much a kind of quick flyby, but hopefully it will give you enough of a flavour for the conversation to then have afterwards. You'll have heard a lot today about people talking about the impact of technology decisions in terms of sustainability and green IT and web design and very many more things. And they're all very much part of this, but I'll explain how it links as we go through the principles. So there are 7 principles within the CDR Manifesto, and the first one talks about purpose and trust. It's about things like digital ethics, AI ethics, understanding the governance around corporate responsibility in the context of the technology that's being used, to have strong governance, to implement and execute strong governance, and to understand how that sits within a regulatory framework, and a regulatory framework that's constantly changing both in the UK, in the EU, and China, and the US, and more. It's about making commitments as an organization to the way that you want to operate, the impact that you want to have on your customers and the planet on which you operate. So purpose and trust is at the heart of everything, and very much at the heart of digital ethics within it. The next 2 principles talk about the impact on broader society. The first one talks about fairness and equity, and it's thinking about understanding how you consider everybody and every perspective in product development, for example. It's not just about having a D&I policy as an organization, but it's recognizing that that's critical within product design, for example, sprint teams, understanding the benefits of diversity to kind of thinking and perspectives around usability of those technologies. But it's also about thinking about employment rights in the supply chain, digital supply chain, so things like the gig economy and otherwise. The second set is very much around data governance and skills and maturity and understanding for people. So the third principle of promote societal well-being talks about things like data privacy and data governance practices, GDPR or otherwise. It talks about the level of understanding in the population. It talks about protecting people from harm, or indeed giving people the skills and training people in the skills to be able to do things in the most effective way. Now, these are important when we come back to kind of look at the impacts of the technology choices that we make, but more about that later. The next set look at around the economic side of that and the intersection both with societal and with the environmental side. So the first one, principle 4, talks about considering the economic and societal impact of the technology choices that we make. It talks about things like automation, thinking about how we think about the broader employment opportunities, training opportunities as we introduce automation technologies into the organization, or indeed the impact of AI and generative AI in whole kind of changing of the working environment. It talks about the use of third-party data, third-party algorithms, critical when you're thinking around developing APIs as well, in terms of understanding what you're using. Too many times organizations don't really understand what's within their software code, what's within the supply chain of the suppliers that they're working with, cascaded down. And it's about thinking about those things in detail. And also thinking about different commercial models in terms of how value is shared across that stakeholder community, not just in terms of the supply chain, but also thinking as you as citizens as well, and maybe the rights that you have over your data if that's being all used and exploited by organizations. The fifth principle talks about the impact economy and how that can be accelerated by using technologies better. Often we find that organizations, big organizations, just don't understand what's out there in terms of startup and scale-up communities. The innovation that organizations are doing day in, day out across the world in terms of environmental or carbon or climate change or societal impact, protecting from harms, privacy, etc. So how do you hook into that innovation? How do you understand how that impacts and changes consumer behaviors for the better? And we do talk about carbon offsets, but only in a way that says that's not the answer. So yes, maybe kind of organizations are thinking about that, especially when we come to talk about the next two principles in terms of environmental impact. But our philosophy, if you like, with CDR is very much driving for what are you tangibly doing to make it different, not what excuses are you kind of using to kind of justify a marketing claim. So the final two principles are very much geared towards the environmental impact. And the first one, and probably my favorite, principle 6, is really around what can we do to make a difference? And whether it's around innovating for the climate and environment, or whether it's around societal even, it's about what can we do to utilize technology to be innovative and make a difference. And this is the one that is critical for everybody listening today. Yes, it's important to kind of talk about principle 7, which is to understand the environmental impact of the technology choices that we make, to understand emissions from a data center or water use or APIs or large language models and things like that. But for me, it's what you do with it that matters. So principle 6, innovate to solve the world's biggest problems. Principle 7, understand the impact of the technology choices that you make. They're both vital, they're both important. So please kind of think, when we've heard about the earlier sessions around sustainable use of IT and what you can do to make it less, absolutely critical, really important, principle 7. But principle 6, how do you think about the consequential impact of the things that you're doing with technology? So recognizing principle 2 earlier on in terms of making it accessible, we've done a lot of work. We, the global community, it's not a commercial venture, this isn't. So CDR community has done lots of work over the last 2 years around bringing this to everybody. We've currently got it translated into over 20 languages, and we'll talk a bit more about some examples of that. But that's an ongoing quest to make sure that people everywhere, no matter where they are, can have access to that research that has been done over the past few years and some of the tools, some of the ways in which we can think about minimizing the consequential impact. So let me give you 3 quick examples. The first one is an organization in Germany called Velida. And Valida adopted CDR probably about 3-4 years ago. They defined their principles around CDR. Everything that changes around digital transformation in Valida is considered through this lens. Everything is considered in the context of any project or change or program that doesn't or isn't consistent with the principles that they've defined, is escalated to a CDR council to ensure that they are following this pathway to have a positive impact on the people with whom they interact, whether it be end citizen, end consumer, or whether it be the sustainable farming communities across the world sourcing the kind of products that they're then delivering to that consumer. So Valida, Merck would be another great example in Germany of an organization that's adopted CDR at scale. In Switzerland, Ethos is an organization that has an influence on the management of the pension funds for the top 200 Swiss businesses. They have immense influence in terms of those investment decisions. And they've been talking about CDR for the last 3 years. They defined a paper in 2020, and they're currently benchmarking the top 48 Swiss businesses in terms of long-term sustainability impact of those businesses in conjunction with working with Ethics Grade to look at that. They've just published their second annual CDR measurement. And then the third example, I mentioned earlier that organizations were translating CDR Manifesto into different languages. I was in Oslo in February, and IKT Norge, which is the Norwegian equivalent in the UK, for example, of Tech UK, an IT association that represents all IT organizations in Norway, have adopted the CDR Manifesto to help think about the consequential impact of the technology and the businesses in Norway. And so, for example, if we took a major sector in Norway, which would be oil and gas, how can they think about how they are innovating to reduce the technology impact, but equally using technology to innovate and solve some of those biggest problems? So that hopefully gives you a flavor of how organizations are using CDR today to think about the impact of the choices they make around technology, whether at an API level or whether at a business level or beyond. So I thought now would be a good time to kind of play a game and think about, okay, so what does that mean? What does that mean for me in the organization that I operate in, or me in the choices that I make delivering the solutions that I'm going to make? So one of the things that we developed a long time ago was a detailed way of measuring the many aspects of each of the principles to help an organization think about their maturity. Not each of the principles is not equally important. Different organizations will have different perspectives on what is the most critical for them. For some, it might be digital ethics boards. For some, it might be sustainable IT. For some, it might be privacy or automation and the impact of managing that transformation and change. But the framework does provide something that people across the world have all agreed is a sensible starting point to have that conversation in depth. So I wanted to start with a silly example, or at least to kind of give a framework for how we might measure that. So if we can simply consider each of those principles on a heat kind of scale of positive, good, green, negative, impact, red, then at least it gives us a quick way of assessing if something that we're doing that's interesting might be scored. And to use something as a silly example, as I mentioned just now, if we focused on reducing the tech environment impact of the environment totally, without considering anything else. For example, all our data centers were green, using sustainable energy. All our web design was kind of minimal impact, ensuring that the per-click carbon impact was low, that the technologies that we used in terms of rare metals or circular economy in terms of the build of those was max. Well, it's great, but without consideration of the consequential impact of those technologies, it's slightly operating in isolation. Would it be good to say we had delivered something that was highly sustainable in terms of the data centers if actually they were used in really negative ways around privacy or having a negative impact in people's personal situation, or ensuring that digital ethics boards had no impact whatsoever? So it's not a realistic example, but it's just to emphasize that point. In terms of a holistic framework that helps guide organizations, sustainable IT is part of the story. But you have to think about the consequential impact of what you're doing with it. And that's a massive kind of debate that then gets into in the context of how do you measure social impact, or how do you measure environmental impact in a holistic way that kind of makes sense and doesn't fall into this path of continuous debate and argument about whether something is right or not. Now, my son has just arrived literally today back from Morocco, and he was in the earthquake. And I'm sure that we've all seen the images. He was lucky, he got out. But many people had no choice. It was an instant kind of thing that happened, and many people have suffered because of that. And I guess my point here is we have a choice to make. We have a choice to make with the decisions that we're making in broader use of technology to try and proactively have a positive impact on people and planet, such that we're not in this catastrophic tragedy space that was unfortunately brought to light this week, both for the people in Morocco and for me personally, because of the experiences of my son. So let's apply that to a real example I was talking about this week. We recently on the podcast, I run a podcast talking to experts and people passionate about this around the world. Recently, I talked to two guys, Ben Jacob and Richard Fleming. Ben is has written a book called The Orchid Outlaw. He's looking at biodiversity. He's passionate around biodiversity and protecting those environments. Richard is a technology entrepreneur using geospatial technologies to help organizations maximize biodiversity net gain through the kind of new regulation that's being introduced in the UK. Now, some of the technologies that he will be using are probably not kind of falling into the most sustainable ones. It will be resource intensive. It will need lots of AI and machine learning. But equally, in doing that, it's also having a positive impact in terms of assuming biodiversity net gain regulation has the desired effect, improving biodiversity within developed land. The biodiversity net gain regulation talks about any development has to be plus 10 or more % within that particular area. So an example of thinking about the holistic framework, this is not about exact measurements, it's about indicative impact so we can see broadly across the piece. Another example might be Excelio. So I mentioned earlier I was founder of a startup at the moment, which is called Excelio. It's a recruitment business, but we're reimagining it in a Gen AI world. And so we've used Gen AI and large language models to design everything. But actually, one of the fundamental reasons for Excelio is to deliver campaigns that enable people, organizations to recruit those really difficult to find roles that society needs. We need more chefs. We need the ability to find more people to do some of the jobs that people just haven't been putting themselves forward for or aren't recognizing as desired career paths. So we're trying to use the technology to have a desired societal impact by enabling organizations to actually create a resilient infrastructure to deliver value for society as a whole. Now, I'm not saying that those are the only two examples, but I'm trying to use them to help think about, yes, it's important to think about measuring the impact of our technology, and I fully support lots of initiatives that have taken place, but actually to think about it in the context of the consequential impact. And I mentioned some of those initiatives, so let me just introduce those. I've been working with the UN and David Jensen in the work that he's been doing with code since the start. CDR is embedded in the Global Action Plan for a Sustainable Planet in the Digital Age, which was launched in Stockholm in 2022. And the principles of CDR that I've just described are very aligned with the 3 shifts that are described in the code's plan. The UN Global Digital Compact was out for consultation earlier in the year, and the CDR community as a whole responded to that to ensure that the thinking within the broader CDR piece was reflected in the UN Global Digital Compact when that arose. Interreg Europe and the EU are funding a 4-year program into CDR and its use in policy across Europe. There are 7 countries currently involved with it. And then absolutely fully connected into initiatives such as the Sustainable Web Manifesto, Tim Frick, I think Tom Greenwood speaking to after me at the event, a key part of the CDR movement. And involved with organisations such as IEEE, where we're part of the standard for CSR and developing a paper around CDR, and indeed the work done with the W3C, where people again like Tim Frick and Lucas Masterlertz have been involved in the CDR initiative too. So in a sense, I guess my point here is, even if you don't call it CDR, the principles of understanding the impact of the technology that we have, but understanding that how to measure the consequential use of that technology for the impact and the positive societal or environmental impact that we have, it's that scale, and all of those things are important. It doesn't matter what it's called. But if any of that has resonated, and if any of that's interesting, then please kind of contact me after this. You can get me through the corporatedigitalresponsibility.net website, or indeed through the podcast that's hosted on any of the main social channels and on most social media, LinkedIn included. Thank you to everybody who's presenting on this Sustainable IT set of tracks today at the Apidays event. And it's been a delight. Thank you for the invite for those who kind of were involved in making this happen. Thank you.